Hey there friends, welcome back to the channel. My name's Alex Laux. Now earlier this year in my video on being an encouragement, one of the things I asked is if anyone had an idea or a burning question that they wanted me to cover to better help them and encourage them in their photographic journey. And sure enough, I did get a response. So here I am today. I'm going to be talking about metering. That is using a light meter either in camera or an external one to help you set the exposure. Now, like most things in regards to photography, there are strong opinions on what's the best type of metering, what's the best method, what's the most accurate, and how you should do it. I'm not going to tell you the best way because even I'm not sure what the absolute best way is. I just use the ones that are best for me in the situations that I'm in. So before we get started, we're going to go back into the studio. I can talk a little bit about the types of metering and what the heck light meters are. All right, and I'll see you back here in a few. So if you haven't been in the photography field for a while or are just getting into film photography, you're probably going to be wondering what the heck is a light meter. A light meter, to put it simply, is a device used to measure the amount of light that is either reflecting off of a subject or projected onto a subject by a light source. There are many different ways to measure the amount of light, including the term candle power. Now, candle power isn't really used much within the photography sphere, but instead, most light meters use what's called EV, or exposure value, which can be then translated into an aperture value and a shutter speed that can be modified to how you best want your image to look and be composed based on ton of different variables, but all equal up to that same EV value. Now, I don't really work with EV. I prefer to work within shutter speed and aperture, but I fully get that some cameras like the Minolta Hymatic 7S or lenses on Hasselblads and other cameras do everything within that EV value. And having EV on a light meter is a great way to make it future-proof against any possible camera that you have in your possession. Most cameras today have built-in light meters that work well and are fairly advanced, but there are still many cameras out there or situations where you want to use an external or handheld meter, whether it's a dedicated unit or an app on your mobile device. Personally, I've worked with these apps and they're okay, but really they're not my preferred method. But they'll work in a pinch. I prefer to use dedicated units. These are devices that use the same basic sensors as built-in meters, and some meters are dedicated to a single type of metering, while others have multiple ways that you can use them to meter different styles and techniques. Some meters are fairly simple in their operations, while other meters are incredibly advanced and have a ton of amazing features available to a photographer. When choosing a meter to use, it's always best to sort of look at everything and what you really want to see in your meter. These external meters will usually display readings in aperture and shutter speeds that you can then set on your camera. But again, they'll also display an exposure value, or EV, which is an extremely flexible system that will allow you to set different apertures and shutter speeds to match the EV value displayed. There's no one way to get that EV value. I've used a few cameras that use EV, but I've never really locked onto its use as an effective system within my own photography. So when it comes to light meters, they are divided into two distinct types. There are incident meters and there are reflective meters. Neither of these are superior to the other, but rather, like everything, there are ones that are better in some situations than they are in others, and vice versa. So the first type is an incident meter. Incident meters are designed to read the amount of light that is falling on your subject from a light source. You're generally going to be standing close to the subject to be able to take that meter reading. These meters often have a sort of a globe over the photocell. Some of the more common ones include most Sekonic meters. There is also the Reveni Labs incident meter and also the Gossen Luna 6 or Luna Pro F in the North American market. These types of meters are really good for portrait work, especially in a studio space where you are working with strobes or where your subject is close at hand and is easily and safely accessible. So the second type of meter out there is the reflective meter. These are the meters that read the light that reflects off the subject towards the camera. Built-in meters in cameras are reflective meters. You also have meters like the Gossen Luna 6F. You can simply slide that incident dome out of the way. And any sort of hot shoe mounted meters like the original Reveni Labs meter, the Aster Hori XH2, and the Voigtlander VC2. Now there is a subset of reflective meter. These are called spot meters. These often will be able to take a reading off of a very small pinpoint object in your scene through the light reflecting off of it. Most high-end spot meters are a 1 degree spot meter. Meters like the Pentax Spot Meter 5 or the Reveni Labs spot meter can do this, but you also have accessories for the Gossen Luna 6F, which gives you a variable spot of either 7.5 degrees or 15 degrees. If you do a lot of work with large format or work within Ansel Adams zone system, good chance you have a spot meter in your possession and know how to use it really, really well. Okay, so here we are for the practical demonstration of metering in the field, especially how I go about metering scenes. I'm here at Sheridan College in Oakville, Ontario, and I'm going to be shooting one of my favorite scenes first to show off how I do things. Now, most of the time if I'm out doing one of these videos or just general purpose photography, I'm doing a reflective metering. So I'm not going to demonstrate how I do that initially. Rather, I'm going to be covering the other two methods that I don't often show or share on these videos, and that's going to be incident metering and spot metering. So I have my Rolleiflex 2.8F loaded with Shanghai GP3 Pan 100, rating it at ASA 100, and I'm going to be developing it in Ilford Microfin 1+3. And I'm going to first off talk you through how I meter these two incident and spot metering, my methodology and my thoughts, and then going to go into a sequence where I'm going to shoot the rest of the roll showing off a reflective metering, an incident metering, and a spot metering, just so that you can sort of see the difference between them while talking a little bit more about the three different types of metering, what they're good for, and how I generally use them. All right, so let's get to that first shot. Okay, so first up, I am doing incident metering. That is where I'm taking a reading of the light reflecting off my subject matter, in this case, this gas control valve here on the outside of C-Wing. I'm going to be using my Gossen Luna 6F. Now, this is a really great meter because it is multi-purpose. I can do incident, flash, reflective, and spot metering with it, as you've seen. So I'm gonna take my meter reading, pointing it at the camera, and I am getting a reading of, I'm going to go with F8 at a 30th of a second. Let's get that dialed in. Thirtieth of a second, F8. Focus up, and I picked F8 simply because I don't necessarily have an easy way to get this in focus, so it maximizes my depth of field. And 3, 2, 1. Nice. All right, spot metering. You've probably seen me use this quite a bit. My trusty old Pentax Spot Meter 5, still working. And now normally if I'm working with a spot meter in black and white film, I am generally picking the darkest area I want the most detail in and then underexposing by a stop, usually by stopping it down by another stop on my aperture, or yeah, that's the easiest way I've come to know that. I learned this technique from Matt Marash of the Film Photography Project. So even though that top part there is about a middle gray, I could take a good exposure reading off of that. I really don't want to lose some of the detail around it, so I'm going to be metering in that indent in the blue right under it. And it's giving me an EV reading of 10. So I'm going to want to, I can actually keep that 30th of a second at f8 that I got off of the off my incident metering, and that does the exact same thing. So I don't have to make any changes. Taking that shot. Beautiful. Okay, that's the hard part done, explaining my thought processes. So let's wander around campus and I'll show off everything in the order of reflective, incident, and spot metering. All right, let's go.
In my experience, there's no single right way to meter a scene. There's only the best possible method for the scene at hand and the equipment you have on your person, but also the method that yields the image that you find most pleasing. Incident metering is great when you have easy and safe access to the subject. Great for working with product still life portraiture, especially when using lights or either strobes or constant. Some meters can even trigger flashes through the addition of a radio transmitter or a direct cable connection. Reflective metering is excellent for general purpose work, and it's the standard on all in-camera meters and keeps you near to your gear. While not totally accurate, it's more like taking a shotgun and hoping you hit your target, relying on the latitude of your medium. Great for architecture and landscape work and general purpose photography when you can't always get right next to your subject easily. Finally, there's spot metering. If you're a stickler for accuracy or work heavily with the zone system, these sorts of meters are great when you're in mixed or different lighting where you can easily pick and choose the elements and apply methods to get an accurate exposure. Great again for architecture and landscape work, but mostly known for those who use large format gear. But as you can see with these images, there's only a slight difference between each of the three images in terms of exposure. In my personal work, about 85% is with reflective, either using an in-camera meter or an external. Another 10% is spot meter, and mostly with large format and some medium format application when accuracy is key in achieving the look I want. And finally, only 5% of my work is with an incident meter. Again, if I need to ensure that an item in a shadow is properly exposed to avoid back or off-axis lights, or with portrait work. Hardly any of my work is with studio or off-camera lighting these days.
Okay, so that about covers it for the practical demonstration here out in the field. But these days, you don't really have to rely too heavily on external meters. I mean, I have to in the cases of some of my film cameras, but for the most part, if I'm using a modern film SLR or a modern digital camera, I am relying almost completely on either the Sunny 16 method or in-camera metering. So we're going to go back inside and discuss a little bit more about what's available to modern photographers today in modern equipment. So all internal camera meters are reflective by nature, but have come a long way since they were first introduced. The earliest camera meters were simply clipped onto or integrated into the camera body and used various cells and power types to read light, and only took an average reading of the whole scene. The earliest cells were selenium, which didn't even need battery power to them, and in some cases these meters weren't even linked into the camera's exposure system, and you would have to simply translate the settings of the meter reading to the appropriate EV or aperture shutter setting. Later, coupled meters used a match needle system to allow the photographer to set the exposure manually, or even allowed the meters to operate in either an open aperture or stop down through the lens TTL metering, and eventually allowed for semi-automatic and even fully automatic exposure settings from the metered reading. Of course, this didn't stop companies from experimenting to get the best possible exposure out of these systems that would be the precursor to modern metering. Of all the cameras I've used, there are a few that do stand out as being stepping stones for these modern systems. The first is a color light compensator that was found in the 1960s and 1970 era Minolta cameras, notably the SRT line of SLRs and into the X series. They used a photo cell that took a reading through the lens and averaged things out with a second cell that was mounted just above the lens. And if you have one of these cameras, you'll probably notice a little red dot. That is that second photo cell. Olympus would go a step further with their OM2 SLR, imprinting a pattern on the shutter curtain that a second photo cell would take an instant reading of the light falling on that film plane, setting the shutter speed before actually exposing the film. And the later OM4 SLR used a multi-spot metering mode to average out the exposure based upon multiple spots reading across the frame. But most famous would be the Nikon FA, which used an early form of matrix metering. Not true matrix metering, but sort of a proto form of it. A chip inside the camera would store a large amount of data of various scenes and could draw on that based on the scene it was reading, and then set the exposure automatically if a similar scene was presented to it. The first true Nikon matrix meter would come out with the Nikon F4. So on modern cameras, the internal meter has three standard modes that vary in name and how they work between the makes and models. But in short, you have a spot, center weighted, and matrix. In spot mode, it takes the meter reading off of a single point. That is either directly in the center of the frame or wherever you have the focus point set. This is usually indicated with a single dot symbol on your meter selection switch or display. On my Nikon F5 and D750, it's about a 4mm circle, or about 1.5% of the entire frame. I use this mode when I'm working with a single subject, portrait, product, or still life. Next is center weighted. This takes most of the exposure reading from that same center point, but averages it out with the rest of the frame. Nikon has had historically the 60-40 system, with 60% of the exposure data coming from the center and then 40% from the rest of the frame. My F5 changed that to a 75-25 split, while on the D750 it's actually adjustable. I use this mode when shooting most black and white films, especially if I'm filtered. Also great with portraits or large groups where I want most of the exposure to come from that center area where my subject is, but I don't really want to lose too much of the environment around it. Finally, there is matrix mode, which takes a reading from multiple points and averages them out. This is great for slide and color negative film, architecture, landscape work, and just general photography, especially if I'm working in auto exposure mode. While the term matrix is used mainly with Nikon, it is also called multiple, evaluative, and multiple or multi-segment, depending on whichever camera brand you're using. Okay, so that talks about all the electronic forms of being able to meter your exposure, but what about something a little more manual? What if you don't like the apps, you've left your meters at home, and you're using a camera that just doesn't have a meter built in? Well, this is where a technique called Sunny 16 comes into play. And it uses simply your eyes and your brain being able to interpret the type of light that is out there. And the Sunny 16 technique, or Sunny 16 rule, states that on a bright sunny day, you set your shutter speed to be the inverse of your film speed, and you set your aperture to be f16. So on a day like today, if I had, say, Ilford FP4 loaded into my camera, I would set the shutter speed to be 1/125th of a second, and my aperture to be f16. If I was shooting under open shadow or slightly overcast, I would open up the aperture one stop to f11. Under bright overcast conditions, f8, darker overcast conditions, f5.6, and in a average Canadian winter, I would have the aperture set to f4. And once you understand the relation between the two, you can start playing with it. If you want to have a faster shutter speed in these conditions, you would adjust accordingly. And it might be difficult in some cameras, especially ones where you are limited by the shutter speeds available or the apertures available. But the best part is that this technique works on every film type I've tried it on. I've used it on black and white, color negative, and color slide film, and I've even used it on digital cameras. In fact, you get the most amount of flexibility on a digital camera that you do on most film cameras because they have stepless shutters. You can set it to any speed you want and any aperture you want and almost any sensitivity that you want. It just is a great tool to have. It might not be the best one in every situation, but in very complex situations where I am not sure if I like what my meter is giving me, I just switch back to that, and I have enough latitude with raw files and digital scans that I can make any necessary adjustments in post-processing. So that about covers it for this video. I hope you have found it helpful and informative and given you a basic foundation on how to tackle your next time you are out and you really need to get that exposure nailed, and given you the encouragement to try out different techniques if you wanted something a little bit different in your photography. Now, like anything, these are just my opinions on the matter and how I approach setting exposure. Am I always 100% right? No, of course not. Do I use the correct method for the situation at hand? Not always, because I don't always have all the equipment available to me, or it is safe for me to do so. I am not one to do a lot of incident metering because I'm often shooting landscapes, architectures, very little within a studio environment or portraiture. Most of the time I'm relying on my in-camera meter or reflective metering. Is it always right? No. Does it get me the results I like? Absolutely. And that is the one thing that is key. The idea is to have the understanding and knowledge of all the tools and techniques available and make them work to get the results you want. So let me know in the comments below, how do you generally meter? Are you incident, reflective? Do you prefer a spot meter? Do you go with Sunny 16? Let me know. If you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing, hitting that bell notification icon, and of course, if anything, leave me a thumbs up if you like what you see, or a thumbs down if you don't. So until next time, my name's Alex Laux. Shoot what you love, with what you love, on what you love. Don't give in to the hype.